This is my true story. It began in a quiet suburb outside Dallas, Texas, where the nights were warm and the porch lights never went out. I believed that family was the one thing that would never let a man go hungry, but I was wrong. My own son, the boy I once fed with my own hands, turned his back on me when age made me slow. One night he said, "Don't come back," and shut the door as if I were a stranger. I didn't beg. I made a call instead. What happened next changed everything. Before that, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my stories reach more hearts like yours. I spent most of my life working long hours in a small auto repair shop off Route 66, just outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. The smell of oil and metal became part of who I was. Every dollar I earned went toward building a better future for my boy. I never took vacations or bought new shoes when mine had holes. My joy came from seeing him eat well, sleep safely, and walk out the door wearing clean clothes to school. I believed that was what being a father meant, giving everything, asking for nothing, and trusting that love would come back when the time came. When he was little, he'd run to the shop after school, covered in dust and full of stories. I'd hand him a soda, wipe the grease off my hands, and listen like every word was a miracle. He'd say, "One day, I'll buy you a big house in the city, Dad." That promise kept me alive through winters, when the wind cut through my jacket, and summers, when the asphalt burned my boots. Every nail I hammered into the house I built outside Tulsa was done with his future in mind. I didn't want riches. I wanted him to stand taller than I ever could. The years passed, and the boy became a man. He got his degree in business from a college in Kansas City. I still remember driving my old Ford pickup loaded with secondhand furniture to help him move into his first apartment. I cried when I left him there, but I didn't let him see it. I thought he was starting his own chapter, and I was just proud to have helped write the first few pages. When his mother passed, the house grew quiet. It was just me and the photographs on the mantel. I thought my son would come home more often then, maybe to fill the silence she left behind. But he called less, visited even less. The conversations changed too. It wasn't about life or laughter anymore. It was about money, jobs, and schedules. I told myself that's how life worked now, that young people were just busier. Still, every time the phone rang, I'd rush to it like a child hoping for a gift. Then, slowly, I began to see the difference between distance and disregard. The tone in his voice carried impatience, like talking to me was a task to tick off. He'd sigh when I asked how he was doing, like I was wasting his time. When I visited, he barely looked up from his phone. I would bring homemade pie, the same kind his mother used to bake, and it would sit untouched. He'd say, "You didn't have to make that, Dad," and shove it in the fridge like it was a burden, not love. Still, I stayed patient. That's what fathers do. We excuse, we forgive, we keep believing. I thought maybe when his own children came, he'd understand. But there were no children, just new jobs, new houses, and a growing wall of silence between us. Every Thanksgiving, I'd set 2 plates on the table and wait, hoping maybe he'd walk through the door. Sometimes I'd even cook his favorite, roast chicken with buttered corn, just in case. The food would go cold, but the hope stayed warm. When I turned 72, my body began to slow down. The arthritis in my hands made it hard to fix engines. I sold the shop, thinking I'd move closer to him in Houston, Texas, where he'd been living by then. I called him, told him I was thinking of moving nearby so we could have Sunday dinners again, maybe share some of the old days. His response was a long silence, followed by a sigh. That sigh told me everything I needed to know. My presence wasn't something he wanted anymore, but I still went. I bought a small place just outside his neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, just a 1-bedroom house with peeling paint and a broken porch light. I thought proximity would bring back closeness. It didn't. Days passed with no visits, no calls. When I did stop by, I could see in his eyes the irritation before I even spoke. It was as if he was counting the seconds until I left. I'd bring small things, a homemade casserole, or his old baseball glove I'd found in the attic, hoping one of them would remind him who I was. Then came the night that ended everything. I had run out of food that week, and the grocery money was still tied up in a bank transfer delay. I decided to walk to his house. It wasn't far, maybe half a mile, thinking I'd just share a meal and some conversation. When I knocked, the porch light flickered on, and for a brief second I saw the boy I'd raised standing there. But the look in his eyes wasn't love. It was annoyance. I told him softly that I was hungry, that I hadn't eaten all day. He looked at me, then said, "You're always asking for something. Don't come back. I can't keep babysitting you." He closed the door before I could even step forward. I stood there, staring at the wood, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. The streetlight buzzed overhead. The air smelled of rain. I didn't knock again. I turned around and walked down the driveway, each step heavier than the last. The house I had built his future from had just closed its door on me. That night I slept in a public park across from the Trinity River. The sound of the water moving was the only thing that didn't judge me. I thought about the years, the sacrifices, the moments I had gone without so he could have more. I wasn't angry, just empty. That's when I realized something important. Sometimes the cruelest words don't come from strangers, but from the people you taught to speak. In that moment, I decided something else. I would never go back. Not to that doorstep, not to that silence. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to prove him wrong by shouting or crying. I wanted to teach him just once more the lesson he'd forgotten, that actions have weight and love has value. I didn't need to raise my voice to do it. I just needed to sign my name, so I stood up, brushed the dirt from my coat, and made my way to the bus station. The next morning, I called my lawyer, an old friend named Henry from Fort Worth, and told him everything. His voice didn't carry shock, only sadness. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "We'll set things right." I hung up the phone and watched the sun rise over the river. It looked almost the same as it did years ago when I used to take my son fishing there. Back then, we'd laugh at the small catches, throw the fish back, and talk about dreams. Now, that same river carried away the last of my illusions. The water didn't stop for anyone, and neither would I. That morning, I took the first bus into Fort Worth. The driver was a kind woman who offered me a free coffee from her thermos. I thanked her, smiled, and looked out the window. The city rolled by. Old brick shops, dusty gas stations, kids running down cracked sidewalks. Life moved on, even when people didn't deserve to. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Not happy, but calm. When I reached the lawyer's office, I didn't cry. I didn't explain with emotion. I explained with facts. I told him what happened, who my son had become, and what needed to be done. He nodded, wrote everything down, and handed me a new document. It was clean, simple, and powerful, a new will. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but steady. I signed my name slowly, like I was writing the final chapter of a long book. When I was done, Henry looked at me and said quietly, "You've just taken back your peace." He was right. The neglect didn't happen overnight. It started small, quiet, almost invisible. It began with missed phone calls that he said he was too busy to return. Then came the forgotten birthdays, the rushed visits during Christmas in Houston, where his wife would stand at the door, pretending to smile, but wishing I'd leave early. I told myself it was just life moving fast, that the world had changed, and maybe I was asking for too much. But the truth was simple. Love doesn't vanish suddenly. It fades slowly, one cold moment at a time. In the early years after I sold my shop, I'd call every Sunday. It was our tradition. I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the small park near Montrose, waiting for that familiar voice on the other end. He used to sound happy to hear me, cheerful, warm, full of stories about his new business. But over time, that warmth thinned. I'd hear tapping in the background, typing, distracted hums that told me he wasn't really listening. Then one day, he stopped answering altogether. The line would ring and ring until it became clear the silence wasn't accidental. I began to notice the distance in every small act. When I visited, he would leave his phone face up on the table, constantly checking it, as if waiting for someone else to rescue him from the discomfort of being near me. His tone grew sharper. He stopped calling me Dad. Now, it was just you. It's strange how something so small can hurt so much. It wasn't just the word, it was the meaning behind it. During one Thanksgiving, I arrived early to help. I thought maybe being useful would remind him of old times. He frowned when he saw me, said the house was too crowded. I ended up sitting on the back porch while everyone else ate inside. Through the window, I could see him laughing with friends, carving the turkey, pretending I wasn't there. I smiled to myself and whispered, "That's okay, son. You have your life." But inside, something in me cracked that day, not with anger, but with final understanding. The refrigerator in my own house started to empty faster. Groceries didn't stretch as they used to. My hands shook too much to drive some days. When I asked for help with errands, he sighed and said, "You need to start depending on yourself, Dad." I have my own life now. He didn't say it to be cruel, at least not consciously. He said it because he believed it. That's what hurt the most, that cruelty could sound so casual. I tried to hold on to hope. I told myself maybe he was under stress, that the business in Dallas had become too much. I even blamed myself for being too emotional. I started eating less, not because I didn't have food, but because I didn't have appetite. Meals felt heavier when eaten alone, especially in a house that once echoed with laughter. I remember one afternoon sitting at the park bench near Herman Park, watching families walk by. Fathers holding their children's hands, buying them ice cream, telling them stories about the ducks on the pond. I used to do that too, right there, at that same pond, decades earlier. My son would sit on my lap and ask if the ducks ever got tired of swimming. I told him, "No, son, because they know how to rest while moving." That memory hit me so hard that I almost laughed through the tears. Maybe I needed to learn the same thing, how to rest while moving away from what hurt me. His visit stopped completely after that Thanksgiving. I sent him Christmas cards, 3 of them, and never got a single reply. I told the mailman once, "Maybe the address is wrong." The man looked at me with kind eyes and said, "It's not the address, sir." I knew what he meant. When my arthritis got worse, I couldn't mow the lawn anymore. The grass grew tall, and neighbors began to whisper that the old man down the street was losing it. One kind woman from the church brought me food sometimes, warm soup, soft bread. She told me to ask my family for help. I smiled and said, "They're busy." But the truth was, I didn't even want to ask anymore. Asking had become a form of humiliation. Still, I kept one thing consistent. I wrote letters. Not to send them, but to remind myself that I existed. Pages filled with memories, regrets, and small moments that used to make me proud. I wrote about the first time I taught him to ride a bike, how he fell and scraped his knee, and how I carried him home on my shoulders. I wrote about the nights I skipped dinner so he could eat another helping. I wrote about how, no matter how tired I was, hearing him laugh made it all worth it. And then one day, I realized I was writing about someone who no longer existed. My son, the one I raised, had been replaced by a man I didn't recognize, someone sharper, colder, busier, someone who had no space left in his heart for the man who built him. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped expecting kindness from him. I stopped waiting for phone calls that would never come. The loneliness became routine. I learned to make coffee for one. I learned to fill the silence with music instead of voices. I even learned to sleep through the emptiness, though sometimes I'd wake up calling his name, only to remember there was no one left to answer. But there was one thing he didn't know, one truth he'd never bothered to ask about. All those years, I had kept the ownership of my home and the business proceeds under my own name. The company may have had his hands on the paperwork, but the signatures still belonged to me. The bank account, the deed, even the insurance policies, all tied to the man he'd decided was too old to matter. That's when the thought first formed. Quiet, steady, undeniable. I didn't want revenge for what he said. I wanted clarity for what I had done. I had built my life with love and discipline, and I wasn't about to let neglect be the final chapter. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Every insult, every ignored call, every empty dinner plate, it had all written a lesson in ink only I could read. He had chosen his freedom. I would choose mine. I began preparing quietly. I organized my documents, labeled folders, and sorted old letters. It was strange how peace came not from anger, but from action. I even started smiling again. Not the kind of smile people give to hide pain, but the one that comes when you finally accept the truth. That week, I went for a walk through Galveston's old fishing docks, just to clear my mind. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and rust, and I watched pelicans dive into the waves like it was second nature. I thought about how they never hoarded food. They took what they needed and flew on. Maybe that's how I needed to live now. Light, free, without expecting anything back. As I stood there, a little boy ran past me, holding his father's hand, laughing about a fish he almost caught. I smiled. For a second, I could almost feel my son's small hand again, soft, trusting, full of hope. Then it faded, like waves washing away footprints. That moment sealed it for me. I knew exactly what I had to do next. When I returned home that evening, I took one final look around my living room. The photographs, the old rocking chair, the clock that still ticked on the wall. I realized that I didn't need to be remembered by the ungrateful. I only needed to remember myself. The neglect that once felt like punishment had become my liberation. I wasn't losing a son. I was releasing a burden. And as I prepared to call my lawyer the next morning, I whispered a small truth to myself. You can't starve a man who has already stopped eating from your table. That night, for the first time in years, I slept soundly. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like peace. That night was colder than most in Dallas, though it wasn't winter yet. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones, not because of the temperature, but because of the silence that follows cruelty. I had walked to his house again, not to argue, not to beg, but because I was hungry. I hadn't eaten properly in days. My pantry back home had half a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter that had turned stiff with age. My hand shook when I tried to open it, and that's when I decided I'd go to my son's place. After all, no father should feel like a stranger in his own child's home. The walk wasn't long. 15 minutes through streets lined with oak trees and empty driveways. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too perfect. The kind of quiet that hides pride behind polished mailboxes. I remembered when I helped him move into that house 5 years ago. He had been so proud then. I carried boxes, built his fence, even planted the maple tree that now stood tall near his porch. I thought I'd be visiting often. I thought it would become a place filled with laughter and family dinners. But as I stood there that night, it felt more like a museum, beautiful but not made for me. When he opened the door, he looked startled, maybe embarrassed. He wasn't expecting me. Behind him, I saw the glow of the TV and half-eaten takeout boxes on the counter. I asked quietly if he had any food to spare, even just a plate of rice or soup. He looked at me with disbelief, as though the question itself was an offense. His voice rose. He said words I'd never imagined hearing from my own child. Words that cut deeper than hunger ever could. He told me to stop coming, that I was a burden, that he didn't owe me anything. He said, "Don't come back if you can't fend for yourself." Then he shut the door, not softly, but with a force that made the glass shake. I stood there on the porch for a long while. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant rain. I stared at that door, the same door I once knocked on with homemade pie, the same one I once painted for him while he was at work. Now it was just wood and metal, solid, cold, final. My stomach growled, but the ache in my chest was worse. I walked back slowly, hands tucked into my coat. Each step echoed in the empty street. I passed the diner at the corner of Maple Avenue, where I used to take him for pancakes when he was a boy. The neon sign flickered, and for a moment I thought about going in. But pride is a strange thing. Even when you have nothing left, you still want to keep that last piece of dignity intact. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to sit at a booth where strangers would ask if I was okay. I wanted silence. By the time I reached the small park near my neighborhood, the rain had started. It wasn't heavy, just enough to sting when it hit your skin. I found a bench under the old elm tree and sat down. The wood was cold, and the air smelled like earth and regret. My clothes grew damp, but I didn't care. I leaned back and looked at the sky, thick clouds swallowing the moon. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up fixing cars to pay for his tuition. The nights I'd gone to bed hungry so he could eat more. The nights his mother and I whispered plans for his future. The house, the business, the stability. All of it seemed so foolish now. Parents don't realize that love doesn't guarantee return. We build our children's world out of sacrifice, but sometimes they grow up and decide to build their own, without you in it. The rain grew heavier. It ran down my face, mixing with tears I didn't even know had formed. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of understanding. This wasn't a temporary argument. This wasn't about stress or exhaustion. This was a verdict. He had decided I no longer belonged in his life. I sat there until the sky began to lighten with the early signs of dawn. The birds started to stir, and the air smelled of wet grass. I pulled myself up, stiff and aching. My clothes clung to my body, my shoes squelched with water, but inside me, something had shifted. The pain was still there, but it had turned into something else, clarity. I walked toward home as the sun rose over the Trinity River. The reflection of the golden light shimmered across the water, peaceful and cruel at the same time. I thought about how the river never stops moving, no matter what's thrown into it. Maybe that's how I needed to be now, moving, not dwelling. When I got home, I changed into dry clothes and sat at my kitchen table. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old coffee. I looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the flickering light bulb, the quiet space that used to hold laughter. Then I noticed something else, a small photo frame on the counter. It was of my son, age 10, holding a fishing rod with both hands, grinning from ear to ear at Lake Texoma. I remembered that day like it was yesterday. The way he ran up the hill shouting, "Dad, look!" I caught one. The fish had slipped from his grip and flopped back into the lake, but we laughed for hours. That photo used to make me proud. Now, it just reminded me of what time can erase. I sat there for a long time, staring at that picture. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking each second with painful precision. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done waiting for him to come back, done hoping for an apology that would never come. What I felt now was something quieter, a sense of closure. I boiled water for tea, though I barely had the energy to drink it. The steam rose like a ghost from the cup, soft and slow. I thought about what I would do next. I didn't want revenge, not the kind that shouts. I wanted a lesson, one that would outlive me, something that would sit heavy on his chest long after I was gone. Something that would remind him that cruelty, no matter how small, always circles back. I pulled out the old wooden box from under the bed, the one with my documents. Inside were the deeds, the bank records, the will. I hadn't looked at them in years. I laid them out on the table, smoothing the papers with trembling hands. My name was everywhere, on the title, the savings, the insurance. His name was there too, but in ink I could erase. I spent the next few hours sorting through everything, marking notes, circling names. I made a list of charities, ones that helped feed the elderly, the homeless, the forgotten. I called one of them, a small nonprofit in San Antonio, and asked if they accepted real estate donations. The woman on the phone sounded surprised. "Are you sure, sir?" she asked. I told her I was. By noon, I had a plan. I would rewrite everything, not to punish, but to correct. My son had turned away from me. but maybe my last act could turn toward those who still cared for people like me. That thought brought a strange comfort. I sat back in my chair, listening to the rain fade into sunlight. Outside, a small bird landed on the windowsill, shaking the water off its feathers. I smiled. It reminded me of resilience, how life always finds a way to stand up again, even after the storm. That night, I slept soundly. No dreams, no thoughts, no memories. Just peace, the kind that comes when you've stopped expecting the world to apologize. In the morning, I would take the bus to Fort Worth to see my lawyer. By the time my son realized what I had done, it would already be too late. And for once, I didn't feel sad about it. I felt free. That night was the longest of my life in Fort Worth, Texas. The city lights shimmered in the distance through my window, but inside my house, it was nothing but silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that feels heavy, almost alive, pressing down on your chest. I sat in my small kitchen, the same one where my son had once eaten pancakes before school, and the sound of the clock ticking became unbearable. Every second was a reminder that I was alone, by choice now, but still alone. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving the streets damp and shining under the lampposts. I could hear cars passing faintly, their tires whispering across wet asphalt. My hands trembled as I held my cup of lukewarm coffee. The same hands that once carried my boy across rivers, fixed engines, built furniture, painted walls. Now they looked like cracked earth. I traced the veins and scars, each one a memory. I thought about how much they had given and how little they had received back. I sat there thinking about the last words he said. "Don't come back." They weren't shouted out of fury. They were spoken like a final instruction, like someone closing a door that would never open again. I realized that night that cruelty doesn't always sound like rage. Sometimes it sounds calm, certain, and deliberate. I walked to my bedroom, the floor creaking under my steps. The old radio on the shelf caught my eye. I turned it on, hoping for music, maybe an old country song to fill the air. But the signal was fuzzy. Just static and faint voices breaking through. Even the radio didn't want to keep me company. I laughed softly to myself, the kind of laugh that comes when crying would take too much strength. I sat on the bed and looked around. The walls were bare except for one picture, a framed photo of my son as a teenager wearing his graduation cap, smiling with pride. That photo used to give me comfort. Now it just made my chest ache. I thought about taking it down but couldn't bring myself to. I'd already lost too much that night. I didn't want to lose that smile too. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, followed by a brief flash of lightning that lit up the room. The shadows danced across the walls, stretching and shifting like ghosts. I closed my eyes and tried to remember better nights, ones filled with laughter and noise. The house used to be alive once. There was the smell of food, the sound of music, the warmth of family. Now, all of that had turned into echoes. I lay down but couldn't sleep. My stomach growled, not just from hunger, but from the kind of emptiness that food can't fix. My mind wouldn't stop replaying every memory, every small thing I'd done for him. I remembered the time he broke his arm when he was 10. How I stayed by his hospital bed for 3 nights straight, refusing to leave until he smiled again. I remembered how I worked overtime to buy him his first bicycle. I remembered the nights I came home covered in grease, too tired to eat, but still made time to check his homework. I wondered how a bond so deep could vanish into indifference. What changes a heart so completely? Money? Success? Time? Maybe all of it? Maybe none. I'll never really know. But one thing I did know was that something inside me had snapped that night. Not in anger, but in resolve. Around midnight, I got up, turned on the lamp, and reached for the old leather folder where I kept my documents. I spread them out on the bed. The will, the property deed, the insurance policy. My son's name was on all of them, printed neatly, just like I'd wanted it to be years ago. I ran my hand over the ink, slowly, as if erasing it with my fingers. It was strange. Even in my pain, I didn't feel hatred. Hatred is too sharp. It burns fast and dies quickly. What I felt was heavier. Disappointment. The kind that settles deep in your bones and never leaves. I took out a blank sheet of paper and began writing. My handwriting shook, but my words didn't. I wrote a letter. Not a rant, not a curse, just a quiet explanation. I wrote that love without respect means nothing. I wrote that family isn't made of blood, it's made of actions. And I wrote that he had made his choice, and so had I. I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside the folder. Tomorrow, I would hand it to my lawyer. The papers would be changed, the ink would dry, and my son would never see his name on my will again. As I placed the folder back in the drawer, I looked out the window. The moon had come out, bright and full, reflecting off the puddles on the street. For a moment, the world looked softer. The pain didn't leave, but it dulled just enough for me to breathe again. I thought about driving away that very night. Maybe heading toward Amarillo, where the plains stretch out like an endless horizon. I could live quietly there, among strangers who didn't know my story. But then I realized I didn't need to run away. I had already left in every way that mattered. I sat back on the bed and whispered into the quiet, "You told me not to come back." "I won't." The sound of my own voice startled me. It was the first time I'd spoken out loud in hours. It sounded old, tired, but certain. I turned off the light and lay down. For the first time in years, I didn't pray for him. I didn't ask God to change his heart. I didn't wish for forgiveness or reunion. I just let the night be what it was, empty and honest. And in that silence, I found something unexpected. Peace. The kind that doesn't come from comfort, but from acceptance. The kind that says, "You've done all you could, and that's enough." When dawn broke, the sunlight poured through the blinds, warm and golden. I got up slowly, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The world outside was waking up, dogs barking, cars starting, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. Life goes on, I thought, even when hearts don't. That morning, I packed a small suitcase, just a few clothes, my documents, and the photograph of my late wife, not my son. I locked the house, turned the key once, and placed it in my pocket. The metal felt heavy, but I knew it would soon be lighter. I didn't leave a note this time. There was nothing left to say. The real message would be written in ink, sealed in an envelope, and delivered through the law. I walked down the same street I had once carried him on my shoulders. The same road where he had taken his first steps, giggling, holding my hand. Now, I walked alone, slower, older, but free. The sky was clear now, painted in soft shades of orange and pink. The air smelled of new beginnings. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe to Austin, maybe to the coast. But for the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't scare me. Behind me was rejection. Ahead of me was redemption. And though the night had been silent, my heart was finally loud enough to say, I was done begging to belong. The morning sun rose over Austin, Texas, as if it had no idea what kind of night I'd survived. The light spilled through my thin curtains, painting the kitchen in gold, but my heart still felt gray. I sat at the table with a cup of instant coffee, watching the steam curl into the air. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left in my home, a place that once echoed with laughter, footsteps, and Sunday mornings full of noise. Now it was just me, my thoughts, and a plan forming in silence. I had always been a man of patience. I didn't believe in yelling or fighting. I believed in doing things properly, the way my father taught me when we built fences back in Lubbock, hammer by hammer, line by line. You can't build something strong by rushing, he used to say. That morning, I decided I wouldn't destroy with anger either. I would dismantle my son's greed with precision. the same precision I once used to build him a life. I pulled out the drawer beside my bed, the one where I kept everything important. The wood creaked softly, as if it knew what was coming. Inside were my files, sealed envelopes, a few photos, and a small metal box that held the title Deeds. My hands trembled as I opened it. The smell of old paper filled the air, a mixture of dust, ink, and years of hard work. There it was. The deed to the house, the saving certificates, the business shares I'd left dormant. Everything he thought was already his. I spread the papers out neatly on the kitchen table. The early light touched the edges of each page, as if revealing the truth I had forgotten. That nothing, not one thing, had been taken from me yet. The house was still mine. The land in Cedar Park was still in my name. The joint business account, the one he used for his small real estate company, was legally under my authority. He might have been loud, but the law was silent. And it stood with me. I took a pen and started making notes. My handwriting was shaky, but my focus was sharp. I listed everything I needed to do. Call Mr. Hendricks, my lawyer in downtown Austin. Withdraw access permissions from the joint account, prepare the will change, and notarize it by Friday. Contact the county office for ownership verification. Donate part of the property to a local community center, the one that feeds seniors on Sundays. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. After writing the list, I took a deep breath. I realized my son had treated kindness like weakness for so long that he forgot what quiet resolve could do. He'd mistaken my silence for surrender, the biggest mistake a proud man can make. By noon, I was dressed neatly in my old suit. It was a little tight around the shoulders, but it made me feel like myself again, a man in control. I locked the front door, tucked the documents into a leather folder, and walked to the bus stop. The Texas sun was already high, heating the pavement, but the warmth didn't bother me. My steps were slow, steady, purposeful. On the bus, I watched the streets roll by, families walking dogs, kids riding bikes, people laughing outside coffee shops. None of them knew the kind of pain a parent feels when their child becomes a stranger. I envied their ease, but I also knew they couldn't imagine the strength it took to keep walking after being told, "Don't come back." When I arrived at Congress Avenue, I stopped for a moment in front of the lawyer's building. I'd walked past it hundreds of times in my younger days. It used to intimidate me. The tall glass windows, the sharp suits, the silence inside. But not today. Today I walked in like I belonged because I did. Mr. Hendricks was still the same. Kind eyes, calm voice, steady hands. He looked surprised to see me, but quickly understood when I handed him the folder. I explained everything. I told him about the words my son had said, the hunger, the humiliation, the quiet decision that came after. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded slowly, then asked me one simple question. "Are you sure?" I looked at him and said, "I'm not angry anymore. I'm certain." He leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "Then let's make it official." For the next 2 hours, we went through every document line by line. The will was rewritten, clean, final, and binding. The ownership transfers were prepared. The legal access to the business account was revoked with my signature and a notary's stamp. Every pen stroke felt like closing a wound. By the end, my name stood alone on every page. When it was done, Mr. Hendricks looked up and said softly, "You've just rewritten your future." I nodded, and I've rewritten his too. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter, not because I'd taken anything away, but because I'd reclaimed what was mine. The air smelled fresher, the sun felt warmer. The city noise no longer hurt my ears. For the first time in months, I could hear my own heartbeat without shame. I stopped at a small diner nearby, the kind that plays old country songs on the jukebox. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, brought me a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. When I told her it was the first proper meal I'd had in weeks, she didn't ask questions. She just poured me more coffee. I sat there, watching people come and go, and thought about how strangers could show more compassion than family sometimes. When I finished eating, I left her a big tip, maybe too big, but it felt right. Money, after all, had caused enough pain in my life. It was time to let it bring someone else a little good. By evening, I was back home. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. It was no longer a place of waiting. It was now a place of closure. I made myself another cup of tea and opened the window. The wind carried the smell of barbecue from somewhere down the street, neighbors probably celebrating something. I smiled faintly. I wasn't part of those celebrations anymore, but I had my own reason to feel content. Before bed, I wrote one more letter. Not to my son, to myself. It wasn't long, just a few lines to remind me of what I'd learned. You gave everything you had, and it was still not enough for him. But that doesn't make you empty. It makes you human. You've built, lost, and rebuilt, and that's what fathers do. You don't need his approval to rest easy. You've earned your peace. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. It wasn't for anyone else to find. It was for me, a reminder that sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That night, I slept better than I had in years. My dreams were quiet, filled not with anger, but with stillness. I saw open roads, wide skies, and the sea in the distance. Maybe Galveston, maybe somewhere else. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. Wherever I went next, it would be far from people who saw me as a burden. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I packed a few essentials, the photo of my late wife, my Bible, a few clothes, and the new will sealed in an envelope. I looked around the house one last time. There were no tears this time, no hesitation. As I stepped outside, the sky was painted in soft orange and blue. The air was cool, and the birds were just beginning to sing. I closed the door behind me and whispered, "It's done." And as I walked down the quiet street, heading toward the bus stop, I realized something that would stay with me forever. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can say is nothing at all. The real change didn't happen when I signed the papers. It happened when I realized I didn't feel guilty about it. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying his mistakes like they were my own. The law had been signed, the ink had dried, and my heart had stopped apologizing for loving someone who didn't deserve it. The morning after my visit to the lawyer's office in Austin, I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunrise spill over the quiet street. The world outside hadn't changed, but mine had. The air felt lighter, sharper, as if even the Texas wind was reminding me that freedom doesn't always come from youth. Sometimes it comes from courage in old age. I looked at the folder resting on the table beside me. Inside were the legal papers, the rewritten will, the property deed, and the formal notice of removal from all shared accounts. His name was gone. My son, the same boy I'd once held as a newborn, the same man who'd told me not to come back, no longer had his claws in the life I built. It was strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean, like finally washing off years of invisible dirt. Later that afternoon, I called the bank from a payphone outside a H-E-B supermarket. The clerk confirmed the changes had gone through. The account was frozen for him. Only I had access now. I thanked her politely and hung up. No anger, no pleasure, just closure. That weekend, I walked to the post office downtown. The air was hot, the pavement shimmering under the Texas sun. I carried one envelope with both hands, thick, heavy, final. It contained a copy of the new will, notarized and sealed. The clerk stamped it with the date, June 14th, and said, "You want it certified mail?" I nodded. The address on it was his, the home I once built for him, the one he told me to leave. When the clerk slid the envelope into the outgoing tray, it felt like the last piece of weight leaving my chest. I stood there for a long time, watching the workers sort mail. None of them knew the story behind that letter. To them, it was just another delivery. But to me, it was the cleanest goodbye a father could ever send. I walked home slow, passing by familiar spots. The barbecue place on South Lamar, the park where my wife and I once picnicked, the old movie theater now closed for renovation. Everything looked smaller somehow, like time itself had shrunk it. But the peace inside me kept growing. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I knew the silence wouldn't last. Sooner or later, he would read the letter. Sooner or later, he would understand. On the 5th day, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I didn't answer. Let the machine take it. The recorded voice echoed through the room. It was him. The words were shaky, unsure, like a man suddenly realizing the ground beneath him had shifted. "Dad, I got your letter. What did you do?" I sat still, sipping my tea. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. Over the next few hours, the calls kept coming, then the messages, then the knock on the door. But I didn't open it. I had nothing left to give, not explanations, not comfort, not even anger. The same man who had told me to never come back was now standing outside my house, begging to be let in. Funny, isn't it? How space feels empty until someone takes it away from you. I waited until he left. Then I picked up the phone and called Mr. Hendricks again, my lawyer. I told him to proceed with finalizing the charitable transfers, the local food bank in San Antonio, the senior home in Waco, and the children's hospital in Dallas. The assets were divided evenly among them. Every penny that could have gone to arrogance would now go to kindness. When the last document was signed, Hendricks said something that stuck with me. "You've not just removed him from your will, Mr. Turner. You've written a better one for the world." I hung up with a small smile. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was redemption. A week later, I got a letter in return. His handwriting was uneven, messy, desperate. He wrote about how sorry he was, how he didn't mean it, how he was going through things. I folded the paper neatly, read it once more under the lamp, and then placed it inside a box labeled "Past." That was where it belonged. Life after that became simpler. Mornings started with the smell of coffee and the sound of birds instead of shouting. I began walking to the park every evening, feeding ducks at the pond. Sometimes, old folks sitting nearby would nod at me, and we'd share a quiet smile, a small, wordless recognition that we'd all survived something. The biggest change, though, wasn't outside. It was in me. I no longer needed his validation. For years, I had lived as if I owed him something, an apology for getting old, for slowing down, for still existing. But now, for the first time, I was living for myself. Every Friday, I volunteered at the same community center I had donated part of my savings to. I helped pack meal boxes for seniors who didn't have families nearby. Many of them were just like me, forgotten by their children, left behind by time. But when we laughed together, when we shared stories of the past, the loneliness didn't sting as much. Sometimes I'd sit with a cup of soup and think of him, not with hate, but with a strange kind of pity. He had everything once: youth, ambition, family, inheritance. And he traded it all for pride. Pride, the one meal that fills no stomach. Months passed, and my health began to fade slowly. My legs weren't as steady, my hands not as strong. But my spirit felt lighter than ever. The house, once filled with tension, had become a quiet sanctuary. The radio played soft jazz, and the evenings were peaceful. I often wrote letters to myself, short notes I'd leave on the nightstand. "You did right. You didn't fail him. He failed himself." Peace isn't found. It's reclaimed. And whenever doubt crept in, that small whisper of guilt that only fathers know, I'd open the drawer, pull out a copy of the will, and read the last line written in my lawyer's hand. "All transfers are legally binding and irrevocable." That line was my final reassurance that I'd done what needed to be done. Years later, when I moved to a small coastal town near Galveston Bay, I brought only a few things: my Bible, my wife's photograph, and that one document folder. Every evening I'd sit by the water, watching the sun melt into the Gulf. The air smelled of salt and freedom. I'd sip my tea and think, this is the life I earned, not the one I was given permission to live. My son never called again after that last letter. Maybe shame kept him quiet, or maybe pride did. Either way, the silence was finally mutual. Sometimes neighbors would ask if I had family. I'd just smile and say, I used to. Now I have peace. And that peace, that quiet, sacred thing, was worth every piece of paper I signed. The letter reached him on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of quiet day when the world pretends to be peaceful while something life-changing hides in the post. I knew the exact time it would arrive. I'd sent it from Austin, priority mail, 2 days earlier, certified, tracked, and stamped with the kind of care I used to give to his childhood birthdays. Funny how much easier it was to send a letter that ended a lifetime than one that once wished him joy. I could almost picture it. The mail truck pulling into the driveway of that big suburban home in Round Rock, Texas, the one I had helped him buy years ago with the down payment from my pension. The porch would still have that cracked tile near the top step, the one I'd offered to fix myself, and he'd brushed me off. That house was his kingdom, his pride. Now it was just a building about to echo. He probably didn't notice the envelope at first. He was too busy with phone calls, emails, maybe that new car he'd leased, all things I once would have admired. But when he saw my name in the return corner, I know something twisted inside him. Because for all his pride, guilt still has a voice, and mine had been silent for too long. Inside that envelope was no anger, no accusations, no tears. Just the truth. The will, clean and notarized, removing him entirely. The deed transfer to the community shelter downtown. The final note. My handwriting careful, calm, deliberate. You told me not to come back. So I haven't. You left me hungry once. Now I've left you full of regret. Whatever you build from here, do it with your own hands. Mine have finally stopped giving, that was all. No love, Dad. No signature flourish. Just the truth dressed in ink. By evening, the phone started ringing. The first call came around 5. I didn't answer. The second came at 6, then 6:30, then 7. Every ring sounded like a confession trying to crawl through a wire, but I'd already decided. Silence would be my final language. Around sunset, I sat outside on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The Texas sky burned orange and gold, the cicadas loud enough to drown the sound of regret. Somewhere out there, my son was pacing his house, clutching that letter, maybe shouting, maybe crying. I didn't know. But I did know that he finally understood what hunger felt like. Not hunger for food, but for forgiveness that would never be served again. 2 days later, my neighbor, an old veteran named Carl, stopped by. He'd been the mailman in our area before he retired, so he still kept track of the routes. He said, "Saw your boy's place this morning. Looked like he'd been up all night. Guess your letter hit home." I smiled faintly and said, "Some lessons take longer to deliver." Over the next week, the storm unfolded exactly as expected. Relatives started calling. Cousins, in-laws, people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my number. They all wanted to mediate, to help fix things, but I didn't need fixing. They hadn't been there when I'd been told to get out. They hadn't seen the empty fridge, the cold dinners, the pride that fed itself while I starved. So I listened politely, then told each one the same thing. It's already taken care of. I heard through neighbors that my son had gone to the lawyer's office, demanding answers. Mr. Hendricks, God bless him, handled it like a gentleman. He showed the documents, the dates, the signatures, all legally binding. My son apparently went silent when he realized I'd done everything by the book. No anger, no rashness, no loopholes. He left the office white as paper. That night, I imagine he walked through his empty house, seeing everything differently. The furniture I'd helped him buy, the tools I'd handed down, the photographs I'd taken. Every item once touched by a father's love now looked like evidence of what he'd lost. The next morning, I received one last envelope from him. It arrived in shaky handwriting, a mess of emotions trapped in postage. I placed it on the table, but didn't open it right away. I made coffee first, the way I always did, strong and black. Then, when the steam cleared, I tore it open. Inside were 2 pages. The first was an apology that stumbled over itself. The second was a request. Please talk to me. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in the same drawer where I kept the original will, and closed it without a word. Some doors don't deserve reopening. In the following weeks, the peace inside my house grew. I could hear birds again in the morning, not the sound of guilt clinging to my mind. I cooked for myself, watered the garden, and visited the senior center twice a week. They asked me to help read stories to the younger volunteers. Most of them reminded me of who my son used to be before pride took over. Sometimes I'd drive down to Galveston, sit by the shoreline with a sandwich and watch the waves roll in. The ocean had a way of reminding me that everything returns eventually, even hurt, even healing. I'd see fathers walking with their grown children along the pier, laughing, sharing fries, talking about nothing in particular. I'd smile, not with jealousy, but with understanding. I had that once, and I let it go when it stopped being love and started being survival. By autumn, the leaves began to change in soft shades of amber and red. Life around me kept moving, but inside, everything was still. My story wasn't one of revenge. It was a lesson written in time and consequence. People think revenge is shouting, breaking, or punishing. But real revenge, the kind that stays, is simply living well without bitterness. It's making sure the one who hurt you remembers your silence louder than your words. A month after the letter was delivered, a friend from church told me she'd seen my son at a local diner. He looked tired, older, lost. She said he kept stirring his coffee without drinking it, just staring out the window. When the waitress brought his bill, he tipped big, like a man trying to feel generous again. That night, I prayed for him, not for forgiveness, but for clarity, because regret is a heavier meal than starvation. I never heard from him again. The phone stopped ringing, the letters stopped coming, and peace settled into my bones like an old friend. The silence that once felt like loneliness now sounded like freedom. I stayed in Texas for the rest of my days between Austin and Galveston, near the people who saw me as more than a name on a paper. They called me Mr. T, offered me pie after church, and asked me to tell stories about back in the day. I laughed again. I even danced once, slowly, carefully, but enough to feel alive. And every time I walked past the post office, I'd pause at the outgoing tray, smile, and think of that one letter. The one that carried both pain and peace in the same envelope. The one that finally made a man see what his pride had cost him. That letter wasn't just paper, it was proof that even a quiet man can make noise when he chooses the right moment. So if anyone asks me what revenge looks like, I don't talk about shouting or punishment. I talk about ink, about steady handwriting on clean paper, about a father's right to choose peace over pity. Because the truth is, sometimes the greatest lesson you can teach someone isn't through anger or punishment. It's through absence. The kind of absence that lingers in every corner of their home, in every empty seat at their table, in every bite of food that suddenly tastes like guilt. I gave him that absence, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that whispers every night, "You had him once, you lost him forever," and with that, my story had its ending. When the letter was delivered, my son thought the world would still wait for him to fix it. But life doesn't pause for arrogance. The fallout came quiet, steady, and fair, just the way truth always arrives. By the next week, the people who once laughed at his jokes started avoiding his eyes. The neighbors in Round Rock whispered when they saw him checking the mailbox, hoping for a reply that would never come. Even the dog next door, who used to bark at everyone, stayed quiet when he passed. Silence had become his new soundtrack. He had built his image like a monument, successful, confident, untouchable. But when a monument loses its foundation, it doesn't fall in one loud crash. It cracks slowly, from within. That's what happened to him. One by one, his friends stopped returning calls. His colleagues found reasons to distance themselves. Even the people who once praised him for his ambition began to notice the small things. The nervous way he glanced at his phone, the bitterness in his voice when family was mentioned, the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. Meanwhile, I lived quietly in Galveston, by the coast. The air there carried the smell of salt and redemption. Every morning, I walked down to the pier with a cup of coffee and watched the fishing boats leave the harbor. Sometimes I'd see old couples holding hands, sharing laughter that only decades of love could shape. I didn't envy them anymore. I just admired them for surviving kindness together. Word of what I'd done spread through the family like wildfire. Some called me cruel. Others called me wise. But none of them had been there when I'd gone hungry in my own home, when I'd heard, "Don't come back," from the very mouth I once fed. So I stopped listening to their opinions. The truth didn't need approval. It just needed peace. A month after the letter, my lawyer called. "Your son came by again," he said. "He's calmer now. He wanted to know if there's a chance to appeal the will." I laughed softly, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. After everything, he still thought the law could undo heartbreak. "There's nothing to appeal," I told the lawyer. "Let him learn to live with what he left behind." Mr. Hendricks sighed, and I could hear respect in his voice. "You've done what most men can't, set boundaries without bitterness." Boundaries. That word had taken me 80 years to understand. Love isn't infinite. It has walls, and those walls are built from respect. Once someone breaks them, you don't rebuild for their comfort. You keep the ruins as a reminder. Over time, my son's pride became his punishment. The world saw it slowly. The small business we'd once built together, the one I started decades ago in Dallas, selling hardware and lumber, began to crumble. Suppliers who'd stayed loyal to me for years refused his calls. Customers started taking their business elsewhere. Even his staff, once loyal out of fear, began to leave quietly, one resignation letter at a time. I never interfered, not once. I just lived. In Austin, where I'd moved for good, the locals knew me as Mr. Turner, the quiet old man who tips too much. I liked that. It was better than being the father of that man. My neighbors brought me casseroles and pie. I helped them fix their fences, gave gardening advice, shared coffee on lazy Sundays. There was no judgment here, just community. One morning, around 6 months after I sent the letter, I got a package in the mail. It was from my son. No name, just his handwriting on the label. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a box of old photographs. Me holding him as a baby, teaching him how to ride a bike, standing with him at his graduation. At the bottom, one note: "I don't deserve to call you father, but I hope one day you'll forgive me enough to call me son again." I sat there for a long time, the sun warming the porch, the gulls calling in the distance. Forgiveness is strange. It's both a gift and a burden. I could forgive him, but that didn't mean he could come back. Some doors stay closed not out of hate, but out of peace. So I wrote a short reply. "I forgive you, but I don't forget. Some lessons are meant to last a lifetime." I mailed it the same day, not because I wanted him to feel better, but because I needed to let go of the last thread connecting me to that pain. From that point on, our paths never crossed again. Years passed quietly. Seasons turned over me like gentle pages. The ocean near Galveston Bay became my confidant. I'd sit on the same bench every evening, watching pelicans dive into the water, thinking about how life always finds balance in its own way. I learned to find joy in small things again. The smell of rain on the sidewalks, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, the laughter of strangers at the farmer's market. None of them needed to know my story. It was enough that I had survived it. Meanwhile, I'd hear small bits of news about him from distant relatives. He had sold the house in Round Rock, moved into an apartment near Houston, and started working at a smaller firm. He lived quietly, they said. Didn't talk much. Looked older than his years. Sometimes regret doesn't kill. It just keeps you company for the rest of your life. I didn't celebrate his downfall. There was no joy in it. What I felt was clarity, the calm, unshakable peace that comes when you finally stop waiting for an apology and start living like you've already received it. In my final years, I began writing letters for people at the senior home. Many couldn't hold a pen anymore, so I'd write for them. Birthday wishes, apologies, thank yous, words they wanted to leave behind. And every time I sealed an envelope for someone else, I thought of that one letter I'd sent to my son. The one that changed everything. Because in the end, that letter wasn't an ending. It was a mirror. It showed both of us who we truly were. He, a man who thought love was something to command. Me, a man who finally learned that love, without respect, isn't love at all. And so, as I sit now, old and content, I realize something I wish I'd learned earlier. Forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door again. It means closing it gently and walking away without noise. I left him with space to think, and he's been living in that space ever since. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came in small moments. A quiet morning in Galveston, the sound of waves brushing against the shore, the scent of coffee brewing on an old stove. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was patient. It waited for me to be ready to accept it. After everything that happened, I decided to start again, not by rebuilding, but by simplifying. I sold what I didn't need, gave away old furniture, and packed only the essentials. My Bible, a few clothes, and a tin box filled with letters I'd written over the years, but never sent. Then I moved into a small single-story house near Corpus Christi, just a few blocks from the water. The rent was modest, the neighbors were kind, and nobody knew me as the father whose son abandoned him. They just knew me as the quiet old man who waved every morning. The first few weeks were strange. I had spent years surrounded by noise, arguments, footsteps, slammed doors, and a heart that wouldn't stop beating fast. Now there was only calm. At first, it felt too quiet, almost lonely. But then I realized that peace doesn't always talk. Sometimes it just sits beside you while you breathe. Every morning, I'd walk to the pier with my thermos of coffee. I'd sit on the same wooden bench overlooking the Gulf, where fishermen cast their lines into the mist. The sky would glow pink and gold, and I'd watch the pelicans dive for fish. Nobody there cared about my past. They just nodded and said, "Morning, sir." That was enough. I started volunteering at a local soup kitchen run by a church downtown. They didn't ask questions. They just handed me an apron and said, "You can stir the pot." Every Thursday, I served hot meals to people who had nothing, veterans, widows, young men trying to find work. When I looked at them, I didn't see strangers. I saw echoes of myself, of anyone who had ever been forgotten. One evening, while ladling stew into a bowl, I met a young woman named Denise. She was in her 20s, working 2 jobs, caring for her grandmother who had dementia. She reminded me of the compassion I used to believe my own child would have. She'd always greet me with a smile, saying, "Mr. Turner, you make the soup taste better when you're here." I'd laugh and tell her, "That's just salt and patience." Over time, Denise and I became friends. She'd bring me groceries sometimes, insisting it was repayment for extra ladles. Her kindness filled a small space in my heart that had gone cold. It reminded me that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's just someone who shows up with warmth instead of excuses. I began spending weekends at the Galveston Farmers Market, selling small wood carvings I made from driftwood. My hands, though old, still knew how to shape things. Each piece had its own story: a bird, a cross, a small boat. People often asked if I made them for someone special. I'd smile and say, "For everyone and no one." Money wasn't important anymore. What mattered was purpose, and for the first time in years, I had that again. Sometimes I'd still think of my son. I'd imagine him sitting in that empty apartment in Houston, staring at a framed photo of us from years ago. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe he didn't. But that was no longer my burden. You can love someone deeply and still walk away when they've made your love a target. I remember one Sunday morning, the church pastor asked me to speak to a small group of men about forgiveness. I stood in front of them, holding a small piece of paper. My voice shook at first, then grew steady. I used to think forgiveness meant letting someone back into your life, I said, but it doesn't. Forgiveness means you stop letting them live inside your head rent-free. You let go, not to free them, but to free yourself. A few of the men nodded. Some wiped their eyes. I wasn't preaching. I was just telling the truth. After that, I started writing short reflections for the church bulletin, small stories about life, loss, and quiet strength. People began calling me the wise one, though I never felt wise. I was just old enough to have run out of lies to tell myself. The more I gave, the lighter I felt. My health improved, too. The doctor at the clinic downtown said my blood pressure had gone down. I joked, that's what happens when you stop feeding stress and start feeding others. Sometimes, at night, when the world went quiet, I'd still feel a flicker of sadness. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was soft, like a shadow that didn't want to leave, but had lost its strength. I'd look at the framed photo of my late wife on the bedside table and whisper, "We did our best." The truth is, I never stopped being a father. I just learned to be one for myself. I cooked healthy meals, took care of my plants, paid my bills on time, and prayed for peace every night. And every morning, peace came back. Faithfully, like sunlight through the blinds. A few months later, I received a handwritten letter from a young man who volunteered at the soup kitchen. He said, "Mr. Turner, you remind me of my grandfather. He passed before I could say, thank you for everything. So, thank you for being that reminder." That letter meant more to me than any apology could have. It showed me that the love you give never disappears. It just finds new people to land on. I realized then that my story wasn't about losing a son. It was about rediscovering myself. About finding peace not through revenge or justice, but through kindness and boundaries. Every person who came through the kitchen, every stranger I shared a smile with, every wave that kissed the shore, all of it reminded me that life keeps giving if you stop clutching the pain. One late afternoon, as I sat by the pier watching the sunset, I whispered a small prayer. Not for forgiveness, not for reunion, but for peace, his and mine. Maybe one day he'd understand what real love looks like, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't beg, doesn't break, the kind that simply lets go. And if he ever walked along that same shoreline years from now, maybe he'd feel it too, that quiet, invisible peace that took me a lifetime to earn. As for me, I'd already found it. I had become my own peace. Now, as an old man sitting by the Galveston shore, I've come to realize something that took me a lifetime to understand. Revenge doesn't always come with anger. Sometimes it comes wrapped in peace. The kind that makes your hands still, your breath steady, and your heart finally quiet. When I look back on everything, I no longer see betrayal as a wound. I see it as a teacher. Pain has a strange way of refining a man. It scrapes away the pride, the expectation, the need to be understood. It leaves behind something simpler, purer, truth. I had spent most of my life believing love was an endless supply, that the more you gave, the more it grew. But age teaches you that love, like energy, must be balanced. You can give, yes, but only to those who meet it halfway. Otherwise, you're pouring light into darkness, and darkness does not thank you for it. In the beginning, I thought cutting my son out of my will was a cruel act. I feared it would make me bitter, that it would turn me into someone cold and hollow. But what happened was the opposite. For the first time in years, I felt alive, free from the guilt that used to hang around my neck like a stone. I had finally taken my dignity back, not with violence or shouting, but with a single deliberate act of truth. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sky turn orange over the Gulf of Mexico. I think about how quiet justice really is. It doesn't need applause or attention. It just exists. Calm, constant, inevitable. The tide doesn't shout when it pulls the shore back. It simply does what it was meant to do. That's how I see what I did. I don't hate my son. I never did. Hate would have meant I still cared about his opinion, that his words could still break me. What I feel now is something softer, a distant sadness, like watching a storm move across the sea that no longer reaches your boat. You see it, you remember how it felt to be in it, but you stay where the sky is clear. Sometimes people at the senior center ask me if I'd ever take him back, if he ever came knocking again. I smile, not out of arrogance, but peace. I tell them, I don't need to open a door to forgive someone. I just need to stop standing behind it. Forgiveness isn't about saying, it's okay. It's about saying, it happened, and choosing not to let it define the rest of your life. And that's what I've done. In Texas, people talk a lot about legacy, land, property, money, names etched into marble. But real legacy isn't in what you leave behind. It's in the peace you carry when you go. My legacy isn't a company or a will or even a story about revenge. My legacy is a life rebuilt quietly after the storm. When I volunteer at the soup kitchen now, I see men who've been forgotten by their families, veterans, fathers, brothers. I see their tired eyes light up when someone remembers their name. And I think, that's worth more than any inheritance. Because being remembered with kindness, that's the true fortune of life. Sometimes, when I hand someone a bowl of hot soup, I feel like I'm handing them a piece of my own healing. Every act of kindness I give now is one piece of myself I've taken back from the people who didn't deserve it. I've learned something else too. Absence is powerful. When someone loses your presence, they eventually realize what it meant. Silence has a way of echoing louder than words ever could. My son may never say it out loud, but somewhere in his mind, I know he hears that silence. He feels it every time he sits down to eat alone, every time he looks at an empty chair, every time he realizes there's no one left to call Dad. I don't wish him pain, though. I wish him realization. That's what every parent who's been hurt truly wants. Not revenge, not tears, just understanding. I hope one day he looks in the mirror and sees not who he is, but who he could have been if he'd chosen love over pride. As I grow older, I've stopped measuring life in years. I measure it in peace. How many mornings you wake up without bitterness? How many nights you sleep without regret? That's the wealth no bank can store, no lawyer can divide, and no child can take away. When the waves crash at night, I sometimes whisper small prayers. Not to change the past, that's done, but to thank God for giving me the strength to survive it, to find meaning where there was once only pain. If I've learned anything in my 80 years, it's this. You don't get to choose who hurts you, but you do get to choose how long they live rent-free inside your heart. And I chose to evict the pain long ago. I now live for the small joys, the laughter of strangers, the taste of warm bread, the feel of sunlight on my face. I've grown to understand that peace isn't found in people or possessions. It's something you build inside yourself, brick by brick, once you stop waiting for someone else to hand it to you. In my final reflections, I realize something beautiful. Even though my son took my trust, he gave me wisdom. Even though he starved me of affection, he fed me strength. And though he once told me, "Don't come back," I never truly left. I just went somewhere he couldn't follow. Somewhere peace lives and pride dies quietly. So, when people ask me if I regret what I did, I tell them no. I didn't remove him from my will out of spite. I did it out of mercy, mercy for myself. Because the man I was before would have begged for love. The man I am now simply gives it to those who deserve it. In the end, my story isn't about revenge. It's about rediscovery. It's about learning that walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That peace is the final word, and silence is the most powerful reply. As I watch the sun dip behind the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and violet, I smile. Somewhere out there, my son is probably still searching for what he lost. A father's forgiveness, a place to belong, a sense of peace. But here, in this little coastal town, I've already found mine. And maybe that's the greatest ending any man could ask for.